If you had to sum up Eddie DeGarmo's 40-year career in music with just one word, that word would be legendary. Pioneering Christian rock with the formation of DeGarmo and Key in the 1970s, a band birthed through a musical partnership with his lifelong friend Dana Key, the group's blend of commercially viable sounds and faith-focused messages consistently blurred lines between the secular and the sacred, becoming the very first Christian group in America to land a music video on MTV. In the 90s, DeGarmo co-founded Forefront Records, the largest independent Christian label in the world at the time, and in the 2000s, well, DeGarmo found his niche yet again, helping shape the mega platform of modern worship music by partnering church songs with Christian radio. Now, to celebrate the release of his first book, Rebel for God, in what he calls a mentoring memoir, I visited with the Gospel Music Hall of Famer at his home in Franklin, Tennessee, to explore DeGarmo's enduring legacy and continuing insights into the genre we now call contemporary Christian music. This is CCM Magazine's Features on Film, and I'm your host, Andrew Greer. All right, so Eddie DeGarmo, so glad that you're here. And when I think back, I think about kind of your first beginnings in the music industry was with DeGarmo and Key, and a lot of people's first association with you would have been DeGarmo and Key. But when DeGarmo and Key was first kind of coming into a national prominence, when you guys were really starting to make a lot of traction in music, really there wasn't this genre at that time that we call contemporary Christian music.
Well, growing up in Memphis, probably the only Christian music that Dana Key, my partner, and I were aware of were either hymns we sang at church or Southern Gospel. And the Southern Gospel guys always had cool suits, so that appealed to
hair.
us. But they had hair. It was just a different kind of hair.
Yeah.
Anyway, so when we first started, it was very organic is the way that this happened. Dana and I both became Christians right when we graduated high school. And we were already in a rock band. And we were already signed to a major label at that time doing rock and roll music. And we just started writing songs about our faith. We had no idea that there was a genre,
being created or even around.
And we just started playing the same places that we played in our dance band. But we were playing these new songs, and we would play at bars, and we would talk about Jesus, and didn't go over quite so well,
Yeah.
So I've done that and kind of experienced it. So then we started getting invited to play at a few churches, and that even went over less well.
Sure, yeah.
Well, it was 1972 in Memphis, Tennessee, and Memphis is kind of the buckle of the Bible Belt.
Yeah.
And, people would ask me, well, why are you playing rock and roll music? Why does it have to be rock and roll? It wasn't a choice. It's just what we grew up on. It was natural. It was never anything more than that. And we knew that music would draw people together and would give us an opportunity to share our faith with them. And that's what DeGarmo Key was built on.
So that was kind of a tight spot, though, right? Not being able to be received in the bars or in the clubs, but also not really well received in the churches. Was there a lot of frustration in those first days of where, you were making commercially viable music, but because of the faith-focused messages, did you feel kind of this just tight spot of where do we go?
Yeah, and we were young. I was 18, 19, and I can remember Sunday morning coming down the stairs and my dad watching a TV guy on television, TV preacher, and from Memphis, and all of a sudden he started talking about, this Christian rock music, they called it Jesus rock, this Jesus rock. He said, there's no such thing. He said, that's an oxymoron. It can't exist. And he said, there's this guy in town. His name is Eddie DeGarmo. And my dad looks over at me, and he's like, son, what have you got?
You made the TV.
What have you gotten yourself into? But the controversy was everywhere. But the upside of the controversy is that's, I think, what God used to drive the popularity. And, rock music and controversy have never been inseparable. I mean, we think,
Sure.
even at the days of Elvis Presley and stuff.
Like when I think about that era that you guys were really rocking and rolling, I think of you guys and Petra as far as rock bands that's about it. Did you know at that time, or did you have any thought or any wherewithal that you were literally pioneering what would become an industry?
No, we didn't even know an industry really existed. as I mentioned earlier, Dana and I had been signed to a mainstream company when we were 15 years old. And we were working on our first record when we became believers. And we actually took our music to them first. And they were like, man, we don't know what to do with that. This is like the weirdest stuff in the world.
I heard on an interview, I was listening to some stories that you were telling in some interviews recently about literally people burning DeGarmo and Key records.
Yeah.
I mean, if in my mind, if I'm in my late teens and 20s experiencing that, I don't know how I would receive that. And yet you're still...
I got pretty thick-skinned about that stuff because I really felt like that we were on a mission from God, if you will. I really felt like that was the right thing for us to do, and I viewed myself kind of as a subculture missionary in those days. And so the criticism, although I have to admit, sometimes it was a little weird. For example, my wife and I, we raised 2 daughters. And one day, my youngest daughter brought home a church bulletin from school with my photo on the front of it. And the title on the bulletin was "The Real Satan." It had my photo. It was perfect. And what was even more ironic, it was the cover of CCM magazine where I was biting a keyboard, So, pretty funny story.
Sorry.
Yeah,
that was before my time.
Yeah, that's right. The Real Satan. And she goes like, "Daddy, are you really the devil?" And then she ran around and ran off,
Yeah.
But so sometimes it would, you'd have to think about it and ponder, is what I'm doing really the best? And there was a time where I really grew my hair really long, and I was wearing crazy clothes, and we were playing a very conservative Christian music festival, and walked off stage, and a young man, probably college age, walked up to me, very clean cut, and he said, "Mr. DeGarmo," he said, "I just want to ask you, how does it feel to be conformed to the world?" And I said, "What do you mean?"
Wow.
He said, "Well, look at the way you're dressed." He said, "You're just conforming to the world." And I said, "Hey, man, walk up on stage with me." So I walked him up to the corner, and we looked out around the sea of the people. And I said, "Well, look out there." I said, "Do more of those people look like you, or do more of them look like me?" He goes, "Well, more of them look like me." And I said, "Well, maybe you're the one conforming."
It's interesting to me that you literally stuck it out in a way. There's a lot of people who would have gotten hurt by that and then blamed that on being hurt by the church or by, Christianity. You don't seem to have that.
Well, I don't know that I didn't get hurt sometimes. I'm human.
Sure.
And I have feelings, and sometimes you'd have to dodge the tomatoes, But when I would work with new artists like Toby Mac or Switchfoot or and I would tell them these stories about the early days Christian. It's like their eyes would get as big as hubcaps.
Yeah.
And they're like, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah, there was a time where it wasn't, quite so acceptable." But I'm not the only one to face that. I've talked to Bill Gaither about that. He faced that in his version in the early 60s. He did. And, and then if you talk to the hip hop artists of today, especially if they're people of color, the black church has been very slow to adopt hip hop, very slow. And so they receive some of that similar criticism. So I'm not the only one to do that, but during that moment in time, because we came out of the Jesus movement and it was exploding, and there was a revival in America and a revival all over the world, we became the poster children of some of that. Yeah. And I think, maybe the darts came a little closer.
Well, it had its own grassroots energy that was able to maybe overwhelm the criticism because it was a pure, in my mind, looking back, just not having been there, but looking back and reading about it and hearing firsthand testimony of that time, it seemed to have a pure energy and a pure motivation.
That's probably right. And, there were a lot of lives that were being changed and impacted in a positive way for Christ. And so that one's always hard to argue with. It's amazing that's, I retired from D&K in 1994. And this is 23 years later. It's amazing to me today how much correspondence I still get, online from people that were impacted in a positive way. Some people, missionaries, some people pastors, just some people, man, you really helped me find my way in life. And so they're still out there.
So Dana Key was more than, your musical partner. He was really your partner as friends since you were, first grade?
Dana and I met in the very first grade, first day of school. He had a little gang of greasy-faced minion kids around him, and he asked me to join his gang. And I said, "You got to be kidding!" I said, "I'm going to make my own gang. I'm not going to join." And so I made my own little gang of greasy little minions. And so we were friends from that day forward, and we grew up down the street from each other, so we were like brothers. And, we formed our first bands together in grade school. I started playing in a dance band when I was 10 years old. And I became a Christian when I was 17. It was right before graduating high school. And the very first person I spoke to and told that about was DeGarmo Key the next day. He was my best friend. And so we skipped school, and that's when he gave his life to Christ.
There's the message. Skip school. Life changed.
Yeah, that's you got to unpack that a little bit.
That's right.
Anyway,
yeah.
So we, didn't realize we were embarking on this journey of Christian music. We just started writing songs that reflected our faith. And when Dana passed away it's been 8 years ago now, we played a bikers rally in North Carolina. And I was driving back at midnight because I had to fly to New York the next day. And Dana calls me on my cell phone. And he says, "Man," he says, "Eddie," he says, "I hear that, that we're up for the Hall of Fame again, and Johnny Cash is up too. Wouldn't it be cool? Because he's from Memphis, we're from Memphis. Maybe we can get inducted." Right. And, 5 days later, he passed away suddenly.
Yeah.
So that was the last conversation I ever had with him. But it was a good conversation. And the good news is we did make the Hall of Fame that year. So I felt great about that.
With Johnny Cash, right?
With
Gospel
Johnny
music.
Cash. Well, Johnny Cash wasn't there either. He was with Dana.
They were having the better time.
They were having the better time.
Yeah. Do you still miss him?
Well, of course. Yeah, we grew up together. And I never thought that I would outlive him. And Dana and I had pretty opposing gifts. And it made for a great partnership. He'll love me when he hears this. He was a better singer than me, right? And he could really play guitar. But I was a better businessman than him. And so we made a good team that way because we fed off of each other's gifts and abilities. And we didn't get on each other's turf too much.
Sure.
Because of that. He was always the guy in front on stage, and he was the guy that, did a lot of the speaking. And I was the guy trying to figure out how to buy another tank of gas to get to the next town, Yeah. And then we wrote the songs together, so that all worked out.
Yeah. As I traced through the book, you have really been a touch point in many people's lives, their spiritual journeys, what you're talking about. I'm born in the 80s, kind of a child of the 90s, so DC Talk, Audio Adrenaline, Rebecca St. James. You're talking about my era of growing up and being influenced by music that had faith-focused messages. So take us up to that time when you're retiring from DeGarmo Key. You actually probably maybe even had a greater influence from inside,
Could be.
or a different kind of influence because of Forefront. Take us to the Forefront days.
It was 1987, pretty much at the peak of my D&K career. Mm-hmm. I felt like that I really wanted to try to be a catalyst to help some other artists reach their generation. And so I formed a record label with some other folks. There were 4 of us in the very beginning, but our manager, Dan Brock, and I became the principals of the company over time. But we started a very small independent label, and just happenstance, one of the first artists we signed was a little-known hip-hop group from Virginia called DC Talk. And the One Way Crew was their original name.
One White Crew?
One Way Crew.
Oh, One Way Crew.
DC Talk.
I was like, wait, there were 2 whites. No.
You're bad. DC Talk and the One Way Crew. That was their original name. And we really felt like that hip-hop had taken hold in the mainstream. And we felt like it was just a matter of time until it was going to take hold with Christian kids. And so we brought them on board. Many people have asked me, well, how did you get to sign DC Talk? The answer's pretty simple, because nobody else would.
Yeah.
And that goes around. I mean, we've heard that story about the Beatles. We've heard that story about others. So they were on the cutting edge of a new kind of music for Christian music. And so we formed Forefront But I wanted to be a conduit to help other artists, continue our platform. Mm-hmm. And I felt like that I knew a little about that. I'd grown up in recording studios and made records, and so.
And you had been along that path.
Yeah, and our job, from DeGarmo Key's standpoint, is we took these artists on the road with us. DC Talk toured with us a couple years in the very early years, and they started gaining momentum and went out, from us to much greater things than I ever did. Mm-hmm. And I think through my Forefront legacy, working with artists like them and Audio Adrenaline and Skillet and Rebecca St. James and Big Tent Revival and Small Town Poets and Code of Ethics and, the list just gets deeper and deeper. I certainly was able to multiply or to see it multiply what I had started with DeGarmo Key to a much higher level. Mm-hmm. I mean, DC Talk, has been one of the best-selling groups ever in the history of
and then
Christian music.
To even offshoot that, Toby Mac,
Yeah.
is now probably a modern pioneer in some ways.
He would be.
Then your tenure with what was EMI but is now Capitol was when the modern worship kind of movement was really becoming, I guess modern worship, had been happening since Maranatha and all that kind of musical movement, but really being accepted as a commercially viable product.
Well, when I started back at Capitol, formerly EMI, Bill Hearn came and met with me, and Bill said, he said there's this budding genre of music that they call modern worship. A lot of it coming from the UK. We've got this little group called Delirious, and he said, I really think you could help these guys. He said, would you consider this? And I was candid. I said, Bill, I don't know much about worship music. I come from an era where it was more performance-based, and worship music is more congregational-based.
Sure.
And I said, so I went to learn about it. And so I went and spent some time in the UK with Matt Redman and Tim Hughes and Stuart Townend and Keith Getty.
This was early 2000s, late 90s?
This was 2002.
Okay.
Yeah, 2002. And tried to figure out the DNA of what made that work. And, the worship movement was similar to the early CCM movement in that most of the artists were what I call bivocational. They had two jobs. And, in the early days of CCM, you couldn't make a living. So for me, I was a carpenter and a painter and a roofer, and because you could come and go at that stuff, And the worship leaders were leading worship at these small congregations all over Europe in the beginning. And even before that, when you mentioned Maranatha in the 80s and early 90s here in the U.S. But what that did for them was, from a kind of a business perspective, it was their marketing. It was their test marketing. They got to write those songs and stand up on Sunday and said, hey, I wrote a new song.
Sure.
What do you guys think about this one?
Yeah.
And so they would do that week after week, and the feedback helped them hone their craft, frankly, in a good way. And so I think that was a lot of what caused the momentum to grow.
Sure.
I can remember Chris Tomlin coming to see me one day and sitting on my sofa, and he says, Eddie, why won't radio stations play my music? Why don't they like what I do?
Now that's all they play.
Yeah. But he's like, why won't
Yeah.
And I said, I've got some experience with that. They wouldn't play
Yeah.
D&K. They wouldn't play DC Talk. I recall a story of DC Talk had recorded a cover song called Lean on Me. Lean on me when times are... And that was the closest thing that we had to anything that Christian radio would play at the time. And I said, but guys, I need to take you in the studio and have you do some ad-libs like, help us, Father,
Yeah,
Jesus,
God, we love you.
Yeah. And they were like, that's so cheesy. I mean,
ding, ding, ding.
K-Max is like, that's the cheesiest thing. And I said, I know it is. But I said, if we do that, you're going to kind of shake hands with those radio guys, and they'll play your music.
You've spent your professional life maneuvering music and business, and then music and business that purports spirituality. Has that been difficult?
Yeah, it has been at times. It's confusing.
Yeah.
You know, it can be, and I've been accused of making money off Jesus, you know, many times in my career. And I thought a lot about it. And I said, well, I think if we lived in a world that wasn't a fallen world, I don't think we'd have Bible publishers.
Yeah.
I just think we'd have publishers,
Yeah.
you know, and I came to peace with all that, feeling like that what I was doing was helping artists sustain what they were doing so they could do it again year after year after year after year. But it does get confusing. It even gets more confusing in what I call the worship space.
Sure. Yeah.
Because you have large churches, which I worked with a lot of them, that would develop these platforms, these worship platforms, and then you have people that it's just human nature to vie for the platform. Well, you know, and vie because I want to get my songs out there, I want to get my books out there.
Sure.
And some
I
of
wanna
that
feed my family.
yeah, and some of that can become unhealthy. You know, I I have a tendency in a pure world. I'm just, you know, and I'll probably take some criticism for making this. I think it's better when church is more like church and business is more like business. You know?
How? So how when like if you think about worship music or music design for congregational worship is such a large business now, how would you do that? Or how do you do that? How have you done that?
Well, I think it's important for churches to get people involved from the business aspect that can support the effort. You know, when I used to sign artists to record deals or publishing deals or whatever, I would make a list of what value do I bring to the table. You know, as a publisher, it would be like, well, I can put your songs on our platform. We had a huge platform called Worship Together. You know, I can, you know, get your songs recorded by other artists because a lot of times worship, and especially in that genre, the artists are not necessarily the same as the writer.
Sure.
You know, they can be different, and as they can be in any genre.
Sure.
You know, I can get your songs in print. I can make sure that they're registered properly, so when people sing them in church, it, you know, we know whose song it is because that, you know, can turn into a royalty for the writer. I can do those things for you. So you have to show your value. And churches don't really have a business infrastructure like that. So I think the ones that have really done well, you know, and this sound, you know, I don't teach this like this is a right way and a wrong way. I teach it like that maybe there's a better way, you know. I think churches do better when they partner with organizations that promote music.
Sure.
You know, like we did with Six Steps, which became Passion City Church, like we did with Hillsong, you know, or, you know, the Bethel folks.
Yeah,
or
so
that
there's
sort of
people aware of the musical elements and bringing the integrity to that
right,
aspect, artistic aspect, and then delivering it to
Right.
people who need it.
right. And I think churches just have to be careful that they don't create celebrities per se within their congregations.
Yeah.
Because that's a slippery slope. And, you know, I used to get criticism for signing my autograph. You know, people would say, some people would critique me and they say, well, how can you sign your autograph? I mean, you're a Christian. And so I tried not doing it for a while. Oh my gosh, that was a lot worse.
Yeah.
You are the most stuck-up person
Yeah,
in the world,
that's
man.
like not saying thank you,
Yes,
right?
I can't believe you won't sign my ticket for me. Why
You're
won't
like, well,
you sign
I'm the
my?
face of Satan.
That's right. That's a good one. So, music is a product, if you will, when it's recorded, and it's something that can be passed around from person to person. And products have a basis in business, and so I don't feel bad about selling those. People would accuse me, well, how you're selling the gospel? No, I'm not selling the gospel. You can't sell the gospel.
Right.
The gospel's for free. You know, even you accusing me of that is not possible.
Sure.
Because I can't do that.
Right.
You know.
And it promotes itself.
But I do sell this.
You know, I think it was your publishers that coined this, that are calling this book a mentoring memoir.
They did. Yeah.
Explain that a little.
Well, when I sat down to write my story and my family story, because Susan, my wife, is a big part of our story. She was there all the way through this, and and made it possible for me to do a lot of the things that I did because I was gone. We've been married 45 years, but she says it's only 22 because I was gone half of it.
Yeah.
Right. So when I sat down to write this story, I just wanted to chronicle at first this story for our family. And then it turned into something else. I started feeling God saying to me, well, Eddie, you've done a lot of things. You ought to write down some of the things that you've learned along the way so that maybe some other people won't make the same mistakes. So I started putting mentoring things in there to young artists, and not just artists, but people in all walks of life. You know, things like, I call it the 4-year principle. If you're going to start a new business, if you can't give it 4 years, don't try. And Susan and I got together when we started DeGarmo Key, and we had 2 children, 2 little bitty girls, you know. Now we got married and I was 19. You know, she was 19. So she's a little older than me.
You were 33?
Yeah. So we prayed and we felt like that we were going to give it everything we had for 4 years. Whatever it took. If I had to work 2 jobs, if she had to work 2, if I had to, you know, whatever it took, we were going to pour into this thing for 4 years. And then at the end of the 4, if we couldn't support ourselves, we were going to take it kind of as a word from above that we needed to modify what I do. And it took every minute of it, you know. And so I would encourage young artists when I would sign them or writers, look, you got to support this thing. Don't act like you're going to make a dime off of this for that period of time. And, you know, do what you have to do, you know. And I've had artists that would come to me and they'd say, well, man, if you could just help me, you know, because I got to work at Starbucks.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I like that because now you're motivated not to work at Starbucks.
Right. Yeah.
You know, if I motivate you differently, it's not going to work the same. And so that's one of the mentoring aspects. Sure. And then, you know, I talk about just some different things that worked and different things that didn't work because I had a lot of those too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's all a part of it, right? And we were talking with someone the other day where they were saying failure or losing or whatever you want to call it is just information.
Well, I mean, we all learn from our failures and successes. Success can be a greater enemy personally than failure, I think, you know, because when you become successful too quickly, I think it makes you feel like you did it yourself type of thing, you know. I would actually hope when I would sign a new artist or a new writer that we would have a period of time to grow into our success. Because if it happened overnight, which I experienced some of that, it was usually very difficult for them.
Fast burn too, usually don't we see that?
Very difficult for them.
Yeah, so I think about, okay, DeGarmo and Key, I think about Forefront Records, I think about Capitol. I mean, we're talking about pioneers in Christian rock, then we're talking about the largest Christian indie, you know, record label in the world. Then we're talking about being a part of one of the largest major labels in the world. And then you never stopped learning because you went back to school. You retired and then went back to school.
Well, I dropped out of college when I was a senior in 1976. And I still remember my mother's finger. Eddie, you have to promise me you will finish, you know. And so I made a promise. And 40 years later, when I left Capitol and I retired, I had this time on my hands that started bugging me. Well, Eddie, you got to go back to school. And I had been offered some degrees, you know.
Yeah, honorary.
Yeah, through the years. And I come from a family of educators. My wife taught college, and one of my daughters is an elementary school principal, and the other is a school teacher. And they're like, Dad, that's cheating. We had to work for hours.
You were given that.
That's right. And I said, well, I work for mine in a different way. No, you can't do that. So I actually went back and got my Bachelor of Arts and finished. And it kicked my tail. Oh my gosh, did it kick me down the street.
Yeah,
you know?
but what a lesson, though. I think continuing in that mentoring memoir down that pathway is, I think what that communicates is we're never finished.
Well, I got to get my degree handed to me and walk across the platform in front of our grandkids, and that was pretty awesome.
Yeah.
And pretty awesome. Proud of that.